Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to be taking a look at the differences between pre and post send. So this is something which is pretty common in audio engineering, whether it's out in the physical real world using mixing desks, etc., or whether you're working in software in a DAW. While I'm going to be demonstrating this using Cubase, this is something which is pretty common across all modern DAWs. I think nearly all of them use the same terms, pre and post send, so this should translate regardless of what you're using. Specifically, I've got a track set up, which you may recognize if you've ever made it to the end of any of my videos. And what I've done here is I've got two group tracks in Cubase, which I'm sending the audio to. And the reason I've used group tracks is because it allows you to see what's happening straight away with meters. So we can see the metering here and we get faders for them, but most importantly, we get channel meters so you can see the audio as it plays. I've set up one pre-send and colored it appropriately, and I've set up one post-send. I've named the groups so you can see what's actually there, but this isn't the sends themselves, this is some group channels, but you can kind of ignore that and just think we are able to see what's happening on the pre-send and the post-send. In Cubase, the way that you choose whether something is pre or post is this button here. So if it's turned off, then you get an orangey looking channel. If it's turned on, then it's in pre, and then you get it blue. So that's why it's colored like this, and that's how they're set up. So let's take a look at what happens once you actually play the audio. In the default state, we've got the channel set at 0 dB, and we've got the two sends set at 0 dB. And if I play the track, which you will be able to hear, we can see on the meters on the right, the pre and post sends are seeing the same level. There's no change between the two at the moment. And that's because there's nothing changing the level. So the way that level changes work in this particular instance is if the fader or the send is at 0 dB, then there is no change in that level. If it's a positive number, so if I put the fader up to +6, then there would be an increase in level. If I decrease it, so if you've got a negative number, there's a decrease in level. We're only going to be using some straightforward numbers, so -10, -20, etc. in this video because it's much easier to understand what's going on. So let's take a look at what happens if I bring this fader down to -10. So now you can see we're at -10 on the fader, and if I play the track, we can see that now our two sends are getting different levels. The pre-fader send is still getting the same level it was getting before, but this one is getting 10 dB less because it's been affected by the level of the fader. If I set this to -20, surprise, surprise, this also ends up -20. And now hopefully you can see why a pre-fader send is useful, because no matter what I do to this fader here, I can put it down to -30, I can even put it down to -infinity, the signal will still get through. Now, why would you want that? Well, if you're in a live sound context, then you would probably want that so you can send monitor audio, so back to monitor speakers or in-ear monitors to the performers. So even if you turn them down on the front of house, maybe in between songs, etc., then they will still be able to hear themselves, and they'll be able to hear themselves consistently, so that level's not going to be changing. It's also useful in production context when you want to send a level. The thing that springs to mind for me is doing sidechain kick. So you might want a sidechain kick which is triggering compressors in your mix, but you may not want to actually hear that. You might just want the pumping effect, or you might be using a different kick in your mix. So in that case, I often do this. I put it on a pre-send, and then I would just turn the fader down or send it nowhere. Most of the time, though, you'll probably want a post-send. So the defaults typically are post-send. So if you had a reverb, for example, that you had on a track, as you bring the track level down, maybe you're automating it, you would probably want the amount of reverb to come down as well. And you can do that by having a post-send because it's automatically automated by moving down the channel fader. That means less will get sent to your effect. So that's the basics of what's happening here, but let's take a look at something where the numbers are different and it's a little more complicated. So we'll put the fader back to 0, and you can see now we're back to the two sends seeing the same level. But our pre-send and post-send actually have level as well. So let's set the post-send to -10. and see what happens here. So as you would imagine, this has come down by 10 dB because we're sending it 10 dB less. This is still at 0 because it's at 0 on the send here. So if we put this send to -10, you can see now our pre-send, even though it's at pre, is at -10. But if we then change the fader to -10 as well, you hear it less because we're hearing it directly, but notice that this is now at -20. The reason being we've got -10 on the fader here, but we've also got -10 on the send. Whereas our pre is only one -10 applying, so it's just at -10 here because the fader doesn't come into it. And that would carry on. If we put this to -20, this is at -30 now because we've got -20 on the fader, and we've got -10 on the send, and that means we end up with -30 overall. So hopefully an example will make the difference between the two types of sends more clear. So I have set one up. So this follows largely the same layout as the previous one, but instead of these being group channels, these are now effects channels, and we have a reverb in each. So we've got the same reverb. It's Roomworks, which comes with most versions of Cubase. It's just on a big cathedral reverb, so you'll hear it clearly. The only thing I've done is change the mix to 100%. So we're just getting the reverb on both of these. But these are largely the same. So the track itself is just a straightforward drum loop with not a lot of reverb on it. It's a tiny bit of ambience on it, but the idea is you're going to be able to hear this. So here we are in the normal situation, which is post reverb. So if I play this now, hopefully you can hear, yeah, we've got way too much reverb on, but that's fine because it's an example after all. If we bring this fader down, you can hear and see the amount of reverb is decreasing. Obviously it lags a little because it's a big old reverb. You can hear as we're bringing this down, we get a degree of automation. The mix is following what's happening because we're bringing this down, so we don't get the same amount of reverb. We get a proportional amount of reverb. If I bring this back up, we're back in reverb land. Now, if we switch over to the pre-fader send, so this is the same reverb effect, it's just in this case, it's on a pre-send. If we're at 0 dB, we won't hear any difference, as you hopefully understand now. So we're getting the same effect, too much reverb for sure. But if I bring this down, because this is on a pre-send, the amount of reverb doesn't change. So you can hear the direct sound is disappearing. And it's not changing at all. If I bring that back in, so hopefully hearing the difference between the two will allow you to clear up in your mind the situations when you might want to use this. So there are situations in mixes where you do want the effect to stay the same while the direct channel fades out. I remember the joy of finding that out the first time I did it. And I was like, oh, this is a cool effect ever. And then a guy I worked with was like, yeah, I think somebody else has thought of that. And funnily enough, they had, but it's still useful. And sometimes you want the reverb or whatever effect to stay the same while the direct sound fades out, but probably not all the time, which is probably why it's a good idea. We've got the option to change between the two at any point. So hopefully this video has cleared up in your mind the difference between pre and post sends, and the fact that pre sends are not altered by the fader level of the channel. So they're independent and they can be useful in certain situations. There's plenty of reasons why you'd want either a pre or post send, but typically the default is post send because most of the time that's what you're going to want. And that's why most DAWs default to using a post send. As ever, I hope you found this video useful, and if you have, please comment, like, and maybe even subscribe, and we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.